Hi friends, I'm Joy and welcome to World Maker Books. We are going to continue today with reading chapters 8, 9, and 10 of part 3 of Black and White by Mark Wandrey. So here goes, chapter 8. Templemere, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm. April 24th, 2038. Terry? He turned to see Doc walking into the moon pool. They were the only two currently in the room. Terry was waiting for the machine to make enough milk for Pokale and for the other seniors to arrive and help. "What's up, Doc?" The older man stopped and laughed, making a funny gesture with his hand like he was holding up something in front of his mouth. What's up, Doc?" Terry's brows knitted in confusion. "Never mind. I need to tell you how I got nicknamed Doc someday. You got a minute?" "Yeah, the guys won't be here for a few minutes. Junior's starving." He pointed out through the ruby dome to where Pokale was swimming impatiently in a figure-8 pattern. Moloko was hovering a short distance away. "Your mom asked me to talk to you." "Oh, for the love of..." "Kiddo, it's cool. I don't really care if you play doctor with another kid your age, as long as they're consenting." "I wasn't..." "Wait, playing doctor?" "Old saying," Doc said. "Examining each other's bodies?" Terry felt his face turning hot. "Uh-huh, that's what I thought. In the hallway?" "I was showing her my scar," Terry said, and pointed at his hip. "You're off by a few centimeters to the left." Terry looked down, tracked in the indicated direction, and the hot feeling in his cheeks turned to molten lead. His mouth opened and closed, but only a popping sound came out. It took him a full 5 seconds to respond coherently. "I was showing her my scar." "It's cool," Doc said. "I mostly believe you." He shrugged. "Mostly. Now, how do you think it looked to your mom? Her son and a pretty blonde girl out in the hallway. You with your pants half off, and her touching your scar." "I didn't have my pants half off," Terry said, realizing how lame it probably sounded as the words came out of his mouth. Doc put his hands on his hips and cocked his head. Terry looked down. "Well, I didn't." Doc stared at him with a hard gaze for a long time, then slowly nodded. "But you do like her, don't you?" "Sure," he said, with a little too much exuberance. "Okay, well, maybe don't show her any more scars in front of your mom." Terry laughed and nodded his head. Doc grabbed him around the shoulders and gave him a quick hug. "Good. Now, how's the program coming?" "I finished compiling it into language I understand. I'm just trying to piece together what it does and why." "You know how much longer?" Maybe a couple days. Hopefully by the time you let me go back out." "You aren't delaying, are you?" "No, sir," said Terry seriously. "Good. I didn't think you would be. Well, we're going to extractor number 4 today to see how much it has on board. The Dolphins found it late last night. They're treating it like a game with the orcas and say they're ahead 1-0. "Sounds like them, all right," Terry agreed. "Good luck." Doc left, and Terry pulled out his slate to work on the program while he waited for his friends. A short time later, he saw the big submarine and 3 of the new mini-subs pass just within view. A squadron of several orcas and bottlenoses were in closer formation. The cetaceans now all had LED lights mounted on their rebreather harnesses, and they cast beams in the darkness as they swam with the submarines until they were swallowed by the sea. The machine beeped, notifying him a bottle was full. He switched it for an empty one and went back to work on the slate to forget the fun he was missing out there. He was just changing another bottle 5 minutes later when Katrina came in. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said back, and immediately came over to help him. The only thing the leg made difficult was carrying heavy things. The full milk bottles weighed in at over 10 kilos. It was a little difficult. She leaned in to help him, and he noted just how blue her eyes were. "I saw Doc leaving," she said. "He was in here talking to me before you got here," Terry said. "Yeah?" "Yeah, my mom narked on us to him." Her cheeks grew red and she stood up, smoothing her shirt back down. He enjoyed the effect. "What did he say?" "Just that we shouldn't do anything around Mom." "We weren't doing anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I tried to tell him." "I mean, I don't even know what you'd want to do." Terry didn't know what to say in reply. What would he want to do? What would you want to do? "I don't know," she said. Katrina was so close, just a few centimeters away. She smelled like soap and mystery. What would we do by ourselves if we wanted to? It was a stupid question, he realized, when she took a step forward and their lips touched. Colin, Dan, and Taiki came in, talking loudly about a movie they'd watched recently. Terry was helping Katrina lift the last milk jug onto the table, and they were both breathing hard and looked a little sweaty. "You guys all right?" Dan asked. "Yeah, why?" Terry asked. "You look worn out," Colin said. Terry swallowed and began to panic. "Of course we are," Katrina said, and he felt his heart leap into his throat. "You assholes are late and left us to do all the hard work." The three guys made rude sounds and waved it off. Terry breathed again and glanced at Katrina, who winked back at him. Terry sat down to let the new arrivals move the jugs onto the edge of the moon pool. It helped him wait until something went away. The boys went into one of the two small changing rooms, Katrina into the other, and emerged a couple minutes later in dry suits, carrying respirators and fins. "We going swimming later?" Dan asked. "I need to work on the program," Terry said. He glanced at Katrina, who glanced back at him. Her eyes held something that was better than anything he'd ever experienced. Oh boy! The moon pool lock opened and Pokale raced in. Moloko followed, considerably slower and more careful. The 5 teenagers slid into the water and spent a few minutes playing with the excited calf as his mother floated around the pool lazily while keeping an eye on her exuberant offspring. They each took a turn being towed by Pokale, an activity he particularly enjoyed, and then it was lunchtime. As always, Pokale was voracious. Dr. Janig discussed the option of increasing his feedings to a 4-meal schedule instead of the current 3. This would necessitate either automating the process or having some staff handle the middle of the night. Regardless, there was no doubt the calf was thriving. He seemed to grow every day. The other researchers were against automation, especially Dr. Orsage. Their only biologist specializing in cetacean psychology stated Pokale got too much from the interaction between Terry and the other teenage volunteers. For the time being, they would continue on as before. Terry hadn't been lying. He did need to concentrate on the program. Only he'd also promised Katrina she could stay. After the brief and exciting moments of kissing, he'd found it impossible to tell her no. Once the other guys were gone, he and Katrina stayed in an unused room next to the moon pool. Outside, several orcas, including Pokale and his mother, were chasing a local sea creature. "It looks like they're torturing it," Katrina said, pointing. The animal was more like an eel than a fish, with a dozen flippers along its length and a wide mouth meant to eat plant growth from the ocean floor. It was desperately trying to escape its tormentors, but suffering from a major deficiency without vision. The orcas bit at it from all sides, Moloko encouraging her calf to join in. "They're predators," Terry explained, "called killer whales by most people." He glanced at the drama playing out, the calf biting into one of the eel's flippers and tearing a chunk out of it. It's natural for them. Katrina looked away as the orcas began to tear the creature to pieces and feast on it. Terry went back to his slate. The Selroth control program was projected via Tri-V in a series of icons, each representing an element of the program. She watched him quietly, perched on the edge of a table. It was really more comfortable than the Selroth-designed chairs anyway, which was why Terry stood. "You've really gotten used to the leg they made for you," she said. "Mm-hmm," he nodded in agreement. "It makes you look like a badass." Terry glanced up at her from the display. She was examining him in detail, her expression indecipherable. He spent a second examining her face, the curve of her chin, the shape of her lips. Her eyes came up and met his. He swallowed and went back to the program. It was just frustrating enough to take his mind away from how it felt to kiss her. "What is it you're trying to do?" she asked. The Selroth wrote a program on their extractors which controlled their actions after they left. Unfortunately, only part of the program was on the extractor. Part is missing. "So it only works if all the parts are there?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "pretty much." "It's an algebra problem then," she said. "No, programming." "But I learned programming is like algebra." He looked at her curiously. "You know, based on the programming, only certain codes and processes could exist, like a jigsaw puzzle." Terry was shaking his head, then he stopped. "Jigsaw puzzle," he said. She nodded and smiled at him. A short time ago, the smile might have completely thrown him off his line of thought, but her comparison had socked him between the eyes more than her kiss had. "Union Standard programming is made up of blocks," he said. "Right," she agreed. "We learned that in school, but nobody really understands them." "I do," he grinned. "Well, kinda. The program blocks are like you said, a jigsaw puzzle, except a woven jigsaw puzzle, where pieces fit together with multiple other blocks as long as you line them up right. The original programmers must have thought in ways we don't understand. It's practically 3-dimensional. But you're right. I think I can extrapolate the missing pieces." Katrina was grinning hugely as he set out all the programming blocks from the extractor to create a palette. After just a minute, he was certain he didn't have them all. However, he still had the files from the Tri-V simulation he'd sold to the Maquis. He set out that palette too, and then compared the two. "Holy shit, a match!" he said. There were 3 blocks in the Tri-V sim that hadn't been in the extractor program. There must be hundreds of permutations. He set about figuring out which jigsaw piece set with each hole in the extractor's programming. It took almost an hour for the first match, then 10 minutes for the second. The final piece snapped into place in just seconds to give him a completed program. "You did it," Katrina said. "No, we did it," he replied. She was leaning over his shoulder. It was only a slight move to kiss her cheek. She turned her head strategically as he moved in, and their lips met instead. His finger absently tapped the Initiate icon. He broke the kiss when his slate blanked and a new display came up. "Oh no, what did I do?" he wondered, and frantically tried to stop the process. He knew black programs could wipe out a slate or even infect an entire network and wreak unbelievable carnage. He needn't have worried. The coding wasn't malicious, it was planning in nature. The program instructed the extractor to operate until its storage tanks were full, then it would move to a specific location, at which point additional orders would be received. A command subroutine would then delete the parts of the program he'd just replaced, and the extractor would blithely return to its task. He looked at the results again. Coordinates were included. "I know where the extracted minerals are," he said. "Do you want to go for a swim?" "Won't we get in trouble?" she asked. Terry glanced at the time, then shook his head no. "I don't have to meet Mom for 3 hours yet. More than time enough to go out, verify the location, and return." She looked skeptical. "There are 2 mini-subs still. One's mine, and another that Doc's people just finished. It hasn't gone out yet, but I have mine in case anything goes wrong. What do you say?" "Why not?" she said. The 2 young people nearly ran out of the moon pool, heading for the lock where the submarines were kept. Terry had been in such a hurry, he hadn't noticed a tiny icon on his slate indicating it had reached out to Templemere's communications array with instructions. He could only think of finding the mineral reserves and being named a hero once again. The slate was in his carrying pouch when it flashed the message, "Communication successfully sent," blanked itself, and ended. Chapter 9. Volcanic Valley, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm. April 24th, 2038. The 2 mini-subs sailed over the ocean mountaintops at a solid 20 knots. They hadn't intended it, but they'd ended up with a massive escort of orcas and bottlenoses. All of them, actually. Doc and his team went in a full-size submarine, and thus didn't need protection from Uhobo. The large submarines were tough and armed with lasers. The Uhobo likely had past experience with them under Selroth command, and stayed away from them. It only took Katrina a few minutes to learn the mini-sub's operation. The controls were simple and intuitive, having been designed for humans by humans. While she didn't have as much dive experience as Terry, she'd gotten more than a little since arriving on Hoarfrost. This was her first time out, though, and Cray had decided they needed a full escort. Not one to be outdone, the bottlenoses had come along. "We need to get there and back quickly," Terry said over intercom between the 2 mini-subs. "The adults will be pissed," she reminded him. "I know, but finding the stash will make it all good. It must have thousands of tons in it." The entire purpose of being at Templemere was to operate the mines. If they could generate a massive deposit of minerals for the Islians in the first year of the contract, Doc had said it would ensure their success. Despite possibly getting into trouble, Katrina seemed excited to break the rules. He'd never had a friend quite like her. A little voice in the back of his mind whispered Yui's name, but the memory of warm, wet kisses made it quiet and distant. "How much farther?" Katrina asked. Terry looked at his slate mounted in the mini-sub's cockpit. The powerful computer was waterproof. The documentation said it would operate in any environment from 5 to 1200 Kelvin, and pressure so deep most life couldn't survive, the advantage of no moving parts or internal spaces. It was effectively grown from crystals as a single matrix. "Looks like 3 kilometers, he said. They were navigating based entirely on the data provided by their reconstructed Selroth program. Since it had provided a destination in the area, he was certain the location must be correct. If it had said the location was on the other side of the planet, he'd have doubted the results. "Even with the heater, it's cold," she said, a shiver in her voice. "You kind of get used to it," he replied. The mini-subs hummed onward. Through the glass canopy, he watched Pokale literally swimming circles around him. Despite not even being a year old yet, he was an incredibly fast, strong swimmer. Adult orca could exceed 25 knots. The calf was having no trouble keeping up with the mini-sub's 20 knots. One of the bottlenoses came racing back from the direction they were heading, suddenly appearing in the dozens of lights from the many cetaceans and orca. It was Wiki Wiki, a female known for her swimming speed. She'd often worked as a scout when the humans had ventured out to explore Hoarfrost's oceans. She'd been clocked in an impressive 33 knots. For a moment, Terry was afraid she would tell them an Uhobo was menacingly close, but instead she had better news. "Machine near," she said excitedly. "Take us there, please," he asked. Wiki Wiki bobbed her head up and down, the lights on her harness dancing wildly. Then she wheeled about and raced back the way she'd come. "Wow, she's fast," Katrina said. "Wiki Wiki fastest swift brother," Cray agreed. his huge bulk accelerating after the bottlenose with powerful strokes of his flukes. The two mini-subs skimmed through the water in the midst of a squadron of orcas and bottlenose dolphins. Terry wondered if this was how a vital ship felt being escorted by warships through enemy territory. He felt incredibly safe. A minute later, his mini-sub sonar showed their destination. Another volcano, this one considerably shorter than the others nearby. Terry watched the depth meter descending and accessed the mini-sub's built-in dive computer. He and Katrina were already breathing a mixture specially formulated for deeper diving. He entered the numbers and bit his lower lip. It was on the edge of their ability without having to undergo decompression. "Is it safe to go so far down?" Katrina asked, obviously aware of the issue at hand. The two mini-subs slowed to a stop, and the orca pod circled back to ring them in. Hokale stopped in front of Terry's mini-sub, looking through the canopy curiously. "What wrong?" Moloko asked. "It's very deep," Terry explained. "You know humans can't dive deep and come up as easily as cetaceans." "Want go back?" Cray asked. The bottlenose dolphins were clicking and singing ahead, already at their destination, inviting them to come join in the fun. "No," Terry said. "It'll be okay if we don't have to go any deeper." He moved forward, Katrina fell in alongside, and the retinue of orcas did so as well. Terry tried not to watch the depth gauge as they continued downward. Despite his attempt, he ended up fixating on it so much he missed the extractor coming into view. When he looked up, he gasped in surprise. "What's wrong?" Katrina asked. "The extractor," he said, glancing over at her and pointing ahead. He could see her inside her own mini-sub looking in the same direction. "I know," she said. "It's huge." "No, you don't understand. It isn't the same as the others. Doc said they were all somewhat different, but—" he shook his head. "It's not even close." Where the first extractor he'd seen had looked like a motley collection of tanks and equipment mounted on a massive, motorized, tread-driven base, this one appeared more like a structure built on the surface of the volcano. It was also many times larger than the other extractor, like 5 times larger. "It's like the extractor fell apart," Katrina said. "Or was rebuilt?" Terry wondered aloud. They finally leveled out as the mini-subs and the flotilla of orcas came even with what used to be an extractor. Now Terry could see his theory appeared to be correct. The extractor no longer possessed any means to move about. Instead, it was built into the side of the volcano. Also, unlike the volcano the other extractor was working on, this one showed no signs of life, either fish or underwater plants feeding on mineral-rich ejecta. Why did it take itself apart, he wondered. Can a machine take itself apart? Katrina asked. "Some can," Terry said. "I think," he corrected. He'd read about nanites in science. The Union had machines great and small. Some were like the behemoths, kilometers across. Others were too small to see, so small they could enter your body and change things. Those were nanites. And Earth scientists had been working toward them for a long time. Naturally, the Union was way ahead of them and had been using them for thousands of years. It wasn't too much of a stretch to build a machine that could simply take itself apart and rebuild itself to do another job. Maybe lacking the space to store all the harvested material for centuries, they'd taken this extractor apart to create a depot of some kind. Perhaps it had been broken and couldn't move anymore, or its fusion plant had stopped working. It sort of made sense. He wished the mini-sub had sensors like a starship so he could scan for a fusion power plant. Unfortunately, he possessed rudimentary sensors like a compass, depth gauge, and temperature readouts. The latter showed the water temp down 3 degrees, further proof the volcano was dormant and extinct. He shivered, and he knew Katrina must be even colder. They needed to get into the base and out of the cold. "Scritch," he called over the comms. "Terry, the leader of Sunrise Pod replied. "Can you look for an entrance, a hatch we could use to get inside?" "We look," Scritch replied instantly. Terry could see the bottlenoses racing around the tanks and other structures by their headlights. In less than a minute, one of them called. Wiki had found an entrance. Terry let Katrina know, and together they accelerated toward Wiki's sonar beacon. The inside of the disassembled extractor wasn't like the other one at all. There was barely any area in atmosphere, and what there was seemed almost an afterthought. He knew there were often no spaces in atmosphere in Selroth bases because they were water breathers. Doc had believed the reason that there were extensive breathing spaces on Templemere was the result of the water being unfavorable to the Selroth. Terry and Katrina spent some time warming up in their dry suits and exploring, but there just wasn't much to see. Eventually, he located a data port and used his slate to log into the system. Like the others, its access code was a variation of the correct code, and he was quickly reading through the files. "This is it," he said excitedly. "There's thousands of tons of sorted minerals here. But why is it here?" Katrina asked. "I have no idea," he said. With full access to the computer, he began copying the entire OS and memory to his slate. With 11 exabytes on his slate, he had plenty of room. He'd only used 2 exabytes, and the extractor's complete memory was less than 5 petabytes. He glanced up as the files were copying. Katrina was examining a locker full of rusty gear. He caught himself admiring the way her dry suit clung to her hips and quickly looked away as she turned around. He was certain his cheeks were bright red. When he looked back at the slate, he saw it had slowed way down. It was struggling with a series of files. Strange, he thought. His slate was massively more powerful than the entire processing power of the extractor. No file should be able to tie up his slate, especially one in an industrial machine like the extractor. Terry waited until the copy was completed, then pulled up the strange file. It was unlike anything he'd seen in the Union to date. At first, he didn't understand how the station's computer could even cope with the thing. Like when he copied it, his slate struggled to load the file. "This is the strangest thing," he said. "What?" Katrina asked, coming close. Terry swallowed when she leaned on his shoulder to look. "It's a file in the computer here. Strangest thing I've ever seen." She watched the Tri-V display the codes moving in 3 dimensions. "Weird," she said, moved around to the side and looked at it from another direction. "It's in 3 dimensions, layers upon layers. I've never seen a program like it." He froze the view and pointed. "Look at those strings. They're almost woven together. How can you even program it? A 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, you'd have to have a strange brain to even understand it. Like the code you put together to find this place?" "A little," he said, "only a million times more complicated. Who programs like this?" he thought. Even more interesting, why do computers recognize it? Terry spent a few minutes examining the other files, then saved them all and put his slate away. He checked his core temperature, then his dry suit's power. They'd been gone 2 hours, and his suit showed 4 more hours of power. "How's your power?" 3.5 hours left, she said. "Is that enough?" "Yeah, if we don't spend too much longer." "We have to go back in the water so soon?" she asked. "If we don't, we risk running out of power for the dry suits." The air inside the station was 10 below zero. Their suits could easily handle much lower temperatures out of the water than in it. Even so, without the hot air blowing, they'd quickly freeze to death. Time to go. The return to Templemere took less than an hour. Terry and Katrina chatted about being out so far and finding the missing extractor. Terry carefully monitored their depth information and ran it through the dive computer app on his slate twice more to make 100% certain they were safe. As they were approaching the dome and the lights became visible, his radio came alive. "Terry, are you out there?" It was Doc's familiar voice. He cringed. He'd hoped they'd beat the Mercs back home. "Yeah, I'm here." "Where are you now?" The question was asked in Doc's serious adult tone. "Crap." "Almost back. We found the missing extractor." "Come in immediately. Kiddo, you really screwed up." So much for a celebration, he thought. For the last few minutes of the ride, he ran the chain of events through his head, including how he'd justified their going out alone, despite the little voice in the back of his mind knowing it wouldn't wash with the adults. By the time the cetaceans bid them farewell as he and Katrina sailed in through the lock, he understood that the idea was far from his best one. Doc and his mother were waiting. Doc looked disappointed. His mother was just pissed. "Yeah, not my best decision," he thought as he surfaced to face the music. Chapter 10, Templemere, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Coro Region, Toloarm, May 9th, 2038. Terry held the bottle as Pokale drained it greedily. He dearly missed his friend's help, but that would still be some weeks coming. Pokale jerked on the empty bottle, reminding him what he was there for. Terry climbed out of the moon pool and got another, balancing the 10-kilogram container in the water where the calf waited eagerly. "Here you go," he said, and offered it to him. It was taken immediately and hungrily. He used to really enjoy feeding the ravenous little guy. He realized more every day that a large part of the fun had grown to include the companionship of his friends, not to mention Katrina, of course. As the calf quickly went through his 7th jug of milk, Terry thought about her. Aside from classes, he hadn't been alone with her since their ill-advised trip to the excavator stash. He'd tried a couple of times, but his mom was always there to stop him with a none-too-gentle reminder that he was grounded for a month. She hadn't even wanted to let him continue feeding Pokale until he played his trump card. "It isn't fair to punish Pokale for what I did," he'd said. She'd relented only after telling him he had to do it by himself. Feeding the calf 100 liters a day was no mean feat, especially by himself. "I miss Katrina," he said to Pokale. Tear, more? The young orca's language continued to develop faster than anyone had expected. Dr. Orsage said she hoped they had more calves so she could study whether it was a phenomenon related to the pin plants or not. The bottle was empty, so he went for another. Almost 2 more weeks before this month of grounding was over. A part of him knew he'd gotten off light. It didn't help when he chafed like he was then. At least she'd also allowed him to continue swimming every day to build up familiarity with the leg. He missed his friends and Katrina then, too. Crap. Finally, Pokale was stuffed, and he swam out the lock to rejoin Moloko and another pair of orcas who were waiting. While the huge predatory cetaceans had no real fear of the uhobo, the calf was at risk. They protected Pokale with the same vigor they'd protected Terry. He guessed they thought of him as their calf of sorts as well. His duties to Pokale discharged, he stopped by the mess hall for dinner. There was a little table reserved just for him, on the far side, away from all the other kids his age, or even close to his age. His friends were all there at the table he used to share with them. Dan spotted Terry as he entered, and waved. The others looked up and waved. Katrina's eyes lit up when she saw him, and Terry felt his heart flutter. For a second, he considered sidling over there as if he was going to get something. When he glanced around, he saw Doc with his people nearby, and he was watching Terry closely. He hoped the man would at least partly understand and maybe cut him a little slack. Nothing could be further from the truth. "This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen you do," Doc had said. "Frankly, I expected better of you. But I guess you just had to step over the line in a big way, didn't you?" Terry hadn't had a response, so he'd kept quiet. Even when the 1-month grounding sentence came down, he'd held his peace. What could he offer in his own defense? It was a dumbass move. He did his best to hold Katrina harmless, claiming it was all his idea, and it mostly was. Still, she'd caught some blowback. Her own grounding was over after 2 weeks. He glanced at Doc, then went over to get a drink and returned to his solo table. Back in his quarters, he was early enough he didn't have to face his mom, which was good. Her reproachful, disappointed looks were worse than Doc's by far. She hadn't said anything more about the incident after the first day. "I trusted you," was all she'd said before pronouncing sentence. He spent 2 hours doing his homework and some time studying pinplant technology. Afterward, he went back to his current personal project, the files he'd copied from the strange extractor. "You want to redeem yourself a little?" Doc had asked. Of course he did. Figure out what the Selroth were up to from all those files. Offered a chance to get out of the doghouse, he went to it. Only it proved much more exhausting than he'd expected. Of the thousands of files, most were routine records of one kind or another. The extractor's original OS was still functioning and creating operations logs dutifully, as it had been for more than 300 years. Each subsystem generated a report each hour. There were 122 subsystems. This resulted in a lot of files. The work was complicated even more because the system didn't seem to follow a normal convention in naming files or dating them. "It's all designed to stymie investigation," he'd told Doc after 2 days of work. "Sounds like a good job to keep you out of mischief," he'd replied. Despite being frustrated, Terry went back to the task. Now 15 days into his analysis of the files, he finally felt he was making some progress. The biggest part was deciphering the file naming convention. It had taken him 2 weeks just to realize that each name was linked with a date in a rotating series of identifiers, and those were in Selroth. He got his slate to translate, and things made a lot more sense. For the first time, he eliminated 90% of the file by identifying their timing to coincide with routine equipment log files. Score. With only a fraction of the files left, he was able to move through them much faster. He hadn't gone back to the weird 3D file yet. He didn't know where to start with it. After the drama about his punishment, he'd checked with the Galnet, but found no help there with the unusual programming methods. So he stuck to what he could work with. Huge groups of files were put aside using his understanding of naming conventions. The further along he got, the better his understanding grew. He intermittently opened files to look for anything interesting. It was close to bedtime when he came across the first files matching the criteria of the program he'd first cracked. "Locate and secure," he read from his slate, translated off the program commands. What does that mean, he wondered, then dug further into the file. There was some indexed information, but nothing understandable would translate. Terry ran searches for related terminology in the files and got several hits. Amazingly, most of those were in the discarded data logs. He recalled the files to view and went over them. "Still working on homework?" Terry turned at his mom's words. surprised to see her there. "No, I was working on the files for Doc." Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Nothing had been said in his punishment about working on the files retrieved from his misadventure. "It's late," she said after a few seconds. "You need to go to bed soon." "Yes, Mom," he said. She watched him a little longer, then went into her room. Terry waited for a moment, then went into the little kitchenette and grabbed a meal pack from the cooler. He collected his slate and retreated to his room, closed the door, and set up on his little desk. The meal pack was self-contained and made by their auto chef. He squeezed the tab and it chemically heated itself as he went back to his research. The meal was almost cold again before he remembered it was there. He begrudgingly shoveled the fish and noodles into his mouth, feeding the machine, as Doc called it, all the while displaying files on his slate's Tri-V. He had the machine's Tri-V range maxed out, with 9 square meters of space in his tiny room full of file elements and floating descriptions he'd added to them. As he worked, he thought the strange 3D file that had made no sense might be onto something. If you could operate in 3D, you could process and collate an order of magnitude more data. He caught himself yawning and glanced at the simple chronometer in the corner of his Tri-V display. It was past midnight already. He'd need to get to sleep or he'd be useless in classes tomorrow, which would get back to his mom. Terry spent another half hour going over the log files, trying to understand what they meant and what the Selroth were doing with them. However, eventually he gave in to fatigue and crawled into his bed. Shutting off the lights, he drifted off with files and content buzzing ceaselessly through his mind. Okay, friends, that is the end of chapters 8 through 10. We hope you enjoyed your time here. And if you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe and share with your friends. We read here every few days, usually twice a week, and we will see you in a few days.